panel of the conference on the topic of cartography and design. Our next final panel covers the intersection of cartography and design. Working as a GIS educator supporting, excuse me, digital mapping at a research university often means design and cartographic expression takes a backseat to expediency. As a cartographer, though, I believe purposeful design is a core component to every map project, whether it is expressly communicative or simply part of an internal analysis workflow. Every map has an audience, every map has a purpose, and the most effective maps are usually the ones designed for those traits. So it's with that in mind that I'm excited to introduce our next panel of speakers who will all be discussing design and cartography through the lens of their own cartographic works and research. Excuse me. Our first speaker is Lize Mogel. Lize is an interdisciplinary artist and counter-cartographer. She creates maps and mappings that bring the politics of place to the surface. She has mapped public parks in Los Angeles, territorial disputes in the Arctic, and wastewater economies in New York City. She is the co-editor of the book map collection, An Atlas of Radical Cartography. Since 2016, she has been working on Walking the Watershed, a long-term engagement with the landscape, history, and politics of New York City's water supply. Liz has had numerous exhibitions, both in the US and abroad. She's received grants from the Graham Foundation, the New York Foundation for the Arts, the Jerome Foundation, and the Danish Arts Council. She has been an artist in residence at Headland Center for the Arts at Fresh Kills Landfill. Liz's talk, titled Embodied Cartography, will explore her shift from using two-dimensional cartographic form to represent the human data that underlies spatial justice issues to a more performative and experiential cartography, an embodied cartography.
Hi, everybody. Actually, it's Lizzie. That's okay. Everyone gets it wrong. I have a strange spelling. So it's really nice to be here, and just huge thanks to everybody who made this happen. It's been really wonderful to be in this community of fellow map heads. So all different kinds of map heads. So that's been really exciting. So thanks to everyone who made this possible, to the team at the Map Center, to David, to Katie, who hopefully is watching from afar. So I'm an artist, a designer, an educator, and an advocate, and my work focuses on maps and forms of mapping. And I'm trained as an artist, but I call myself a counter-cartographer. So counter-cartography appropriates map design conventions in order to analyze and represent power dynamics, challenge territorial norms, support and represent social movements, and bring marginalized histories to the surface. It's used by artists, designers, and cartographers to visualize the complexity of the human experience within the form of the map. Let's see, everybody else had problems with this. Am I clicking on the big screen? Oh, just do that. Yeah, perfect. That's easier. Okay. So counter-cartography makes the politics of space, of place visible, and brings spatial justice issues to the surface. And I define spatial justice as the equitable use of and self-determination over space, more than physical space, but also cultural space, political space, social space. Most of my past work has been making maps that are mappy, that use recognizable geographic imagery. Sometimes there's a map fold involved. They use a similar design vernacular to official maps. And in the past, I've used the inherent authority of maps as a strategy for inserting counter-narratives into public space. And sometimes these maps are made with participation from the community that they are then distributed back to, and some of you might be familiar with this little project. So in the past 25 years, working with counter-cartography, I've worked to make maps that reflect the complicated human and sometimes non-human experience within a place, and make maps that also engage people in the myriad meanings and potentials of that place. So my strategy on how to do this has shifted over the years, moving from maps that merely represent social issues to mappings that ask people to embody them. So I'm going to start with an old project from 2011. And so this is the Sharjah InfoCart city map. And it was a project that was commissioned for the 10th Sharjah Biennial in the United Arab Emirates. And it's a collaboration with Alexis Bagat, who is the guy with the blue tote bag, who was my co-editor on the Atlas of Radical Cartography. And also, it was a collaboration. It was about 20 people in Sharjah and in the United States. And it's a participatory mapping of the city of Sharjah, which is the main part of the emirate. And so we began by producing, actually I'll go back, the info cart, which you see here, in collaboration with design and architecture students at the American University in Sharjah. And it's a mobile information kiosk. And it was deployed in shopping malls and outdoor public spaces in Sharjah during January and February 2011. And shopping malls because they are de facto public spaces because of the extreme heat in that country. So we use the info cart to collect data, information, and stories from residents. And we worked with around 10 local cart operators from different nationalities so that we could reach different parts of the population. And as an initial point of connection, we asked people to fill out a survey with some basic information about their life in Sharjah, starting with like the kind of basic question, where are you from? Which like in this, in this context, we're not supposed to ask that, right? But in Sharjah, it's like a very important kind of initial point of connection. And so that often led to longer conversations. And we also interviewed other people with knowledge of Sharjah, including city planners and journalists. We collected location data, for example, where all of the mosques were in the city or where the bus routes were, which was surprisingly hard to find. The largest data set however, was what I would call what people told us. So personal narratives and experiences of Sharjah. And so from this data, we created the Sharjah city map with the help of a designer in New York and a designer in Sharjah, representing as much of this data as we could. And there's one over there, and there's like an actual copy floating around somewhere in this room. And so it's a bit of an exercise in design maximalism, but we needed it to encompass the variety of experiences that were told to us and that we wanted to honor. And it also, I think, reflects something of the vibrancy and the complexity of the city. So the official language in Sharjah is Arabic, and most public information is in Arabic and also in English, but 80% or more of the residents in the UAE are from other places, so mainly South Asia and the Gulf region. So we printed the city map in 6 of those languages. And so it's in Arabic and English, Urdu and Malayali, and Bangla and Tagalog. And so the city map, it's a functional map that contains local knowledge as well as subtle and political commentary on life in Sharjah, because it's not a place where you can necessarily be politically outspoken. And in a place where almost all representations of the city are created by and for the elites, including tourists, the city map represents the spatial experiences of ordinary people. So we made the map, we redistributed it out into the public through the info cart. So the info cart started out as collecting information, and then it distributed information. And this was on a public street outside of the main biennial area. And maps were available for anyone to take, and they were replenished daily. And I think about 1,500 of them, were taken in the course of the exhibition, which actually was a low number considering we didn't have the best distribution. So here's a couple features of the map, and you can take a closer look over there. So at the time in 2011, most drivers did not have a smartphone or have GPS in their car. And maps in general were not widely used. And so while we did create this kind of usable roadmap, we actually put very few street names on it. And instead we pulled out some of the city's landmarks to represent visually how people actually orient themselves and move through space. And Sharjah has like these incredible landmarks. It was like designed after sort of British ideas about roads. And so there's a lot of roundabouts. And in each of those roundabouts is like this amazing statue. And that's what they're called. It's like the book roundabout has a statue of the Quran, and the ship roundabout has a big ship sculpture. And so that's how people navigate, kind of the way we all navigate, right? The compass rose. Instead of cardinal directions, it points to places where people told us they were from. So we've got Damascus, Baghdad, Mosul, Bandar Abbas, Almaty, Kabul, Doha. The legend, which I don't have a big image of here, sorry, has some of the usual things you'll see in a tourist map, but also other symbols that pointed to things that were very specific to local experience and pointed to other things that were invisible to official radar on purpose. And so this is the back of the map. Lots of different kinds of data visualization. We just like threw it all in there. We couldn't help ourselves. And I just want to talk about this little flag graphic. In the UAE, only Emiratis have citizenship rights, and that is supposedly only 5 to 10% of the population. But the Emirati governments in general do not release demographic information for various reasons. So we did our own unofficial demographic survey from that question, where are you from? And sample size 500. And we represented it on the map. And I have to say it's a little skewed because we had 3 Filipina cart operators, and the population from the Philippines is probably a lot less than, for example, people from the population from Pakistan. So there's a bias in here. So like the Sharjah city map, the end product of a lot of my past work was more conventionally representational, describing social issues on the flat plane of a printed map. And so as a map person, I'm very committed to the geographic as a way to talk about complex socio-political issues. But I also wanted to create projects that had more impact. In my day job, I work with community organizations. So I wanted, I learned from them basically, like I want to have actual impact besides in like this very small cultural space that I operate in. So I wanted projects that would give people a deeper connection to the issues and that could possibly transform the casual bystander or map consumer into a more engaged supporter. So in the past several years, I've become more interested in creating an embodied cartography as a more effective strategy for engaging people in the politics of place and to have, like I said, more of an impact towards advocacy goals. So with embodied cartography, instead of asking viewers to see the map, I'm asking participants to perform the map or even be the map. And so let's look at some examples. This is an older project from 2010, but it's kind of the first one in this, in moving towards embodied cartography, but also with my, obsession of the last, 15 years, which is water. And so I've been doing a lot of work about water infrastructure, particularly both drinking water and wastewater, and the social costs and the justice issues around this part of the urban commons. So I've been thinking a lot about these issues in the context of New York City, where I'm from and where I live now. And most water and wastewater infrastructure is invisible to most of the people who use it. And it has major impacts, equally invisible, to the local communities in which that infrastructure is placed and managed. So if you think about wastewater treatment plants. Much of my recent work is about making these relationships visible by asking people to literally and metaphorically embody their infrastructure. So let's start with wastewater at one end of the water system, the urban water system. So if we think about the city as an extension of the human body, then infrastructure like wastewater treatment is part of a natural cycle of input and output. But the geography and the economy of waste are much removed from our actual bodies. And so this project, the sludge economy, had a number of elements, including this printed piece, which I don't love. I have to say, I did this as a design piece very quickly, but it has a lot of, there's data viz, there's maps, it's got timeline, it's got some things that we've been talking about during this conference. So I decided to put it up there. But my favorite part of this project, so there was a printed piece, there was a wall mural, there was public events. But my favorite part of this project was part of a public event that I organized in a public park that sits on top of a wastewater treatment plant in New York City on the Upper West Side along the Hudson. And so this event included a potluck picnic and a lecture, and it was called This Picnic Stinks. Because, you're in a park, but you're on top of a wastewater treatment plant. And when the wind is blowing the right way, it smells a little. So I illustrated my lecture with this. This is a cake. It's chocolate, of course, because we're talking about wastewater, and I can't resist a joke like that. And so what it's iced with is the Department of Environmental Protection, which I think of as my unwitting collaborator, because that is the city agency that manages water and wastewater in New York City. And so the DEP, so this is their map of sewer sheds in New York City, and the M&Ms are demarcating the wastewater treatment plants. And so we were able to eat our infrastructure, and I made the cake myself, so it was delicious. And then actually, I never showed this slide, but I wanted to show this because a couple of years ago, I was in a show at Soma Arts, and I did a project, a wall map about wastewater treatment in the Bay. And so I made another sludge cake, and I don't remember where I got this map from. Apologies. But I think I found an official map and I kind of, gussied it up a bit, and then we made a sludge cake and ate the cake. So, this is a little bit potty humor, but by literally embodying, their infrastructure, people became much more aware of their role as both producers of waste and consumers, not just of cake, but of public infrastructure services like wastewater treatment and how that infrastructure impacts other communities. So since 2016, I've been working mostly on a project called Walking the Watershed. And this is a long-term project about the landscape, the history, and the politics of New York City's water supply and the relationship between the city and the mostly rural communities that supply its water. And here's my site. So it's a deep engagement with the Catskills, which is about 100 miles north of New York City, very mountainous. Some of you may have been to the Catskills State Park. And 90% of the city's drinking water comes from here. But the construction of the city's water supply and its related water management policy completely reshaped the geography, the economy, and the social fabric of the Catskills. So to make a very long story very short, and I have to say this is the shortest I've ever told this story, at the turn of the 20th century, the city began a 60-year-long infrastructure project that displaced and economically disenfranchised dozens of tight-knit rural communities and left scars that generations later still resonate. But in the early 90s, thanks to the Clean Water Act and other federal environmental legislation, Catskills towns were able to organize, they gained power, they pushed back at the city, and they got a seat at the table, at the negotiating table. And the result of this was a mutually beneficial water management policy that was co-created by the city and the Catskills and the state and other actors, which is kind of unprecedented. And so the Catskills and the city, they're inextricably connected by water. 5 minutes, okay, I'll talk faster. This relationship is really extraordinarily complicated, and it's negotiated through agreements, through policies, through legislation, through lawsuits. And it's a contradictory relationship. It's both symbiotic and extractive. And the relationship is very visible to people in the Catskills because they live it every day. But it's invisible to New York City residents. So this is the sort of mission of the Walking the Watershed project, is to bring visibility in ways that are experiential, that are participatory and embodied, and also cartographic. So I've often used the strategy of the tour map, the tour guide or the critical tour as a more embodied way to immerse people in the spatial politics of a particular site. And I like to think of the critical tour as performing the map. Or maybe since we're in the Bay Area, you can think about tours of like the UX of map design. And I'm just gonna, these are just, look, it's counter-cartographers pointing at things. I'm gonna breeze through these because I have little time left. So these are just a couple of projects and they're on my website, so you can check them out, of tour, like actual tours, audio tours, tour maps that I've done over the years. I really do love this quote from the artist Sarah Knaus. It's quite shortened it a bit. Critical tours are explorations of the discursivity of site explored in situ. Connections between concepts, images, histories, and places are produced through bodily movement. The insight metaphorically invoked as a change in perspective is, on the tour, both physical and perceptual. So in 2019, I launched the tour project Views from the Watershed and led guided bus tours of the New York City watershed, water system in the Catskills. And I did this in 2019, pandemic pause, in 2022. And my goal for the project was to create a kind of water supply tourism that raises awareness in this experiential embodied way about the relationship between those communities. Skip a little. The Catskills is a tourist economy, partly because of the restrictions on the land use from the water system. But these tours, instead of focusing on the normal tourist stuff, they focus on the social and political conditions under which New York City's water gets to residents. And in a region where government produces the dominant narrative of place, these tours put together a very different public imaginary that elevates local voices. And so here's the tour map. Some of these tours are 6 hours. They cover 110 miles. They visit 2 major reservoirs, a couple of streams, a cemetery, and other places along the way. We go walk on dams. We talk to people from the DEP. They talk to us. Lots of local people come and meet the group at each stop. This is an environmental planner who works on stream restoration and flood control. Here we are again with more flood control folks in a stream bed that was restored. We talked to a grave restorer who tends the cemetery where the bodies from the graves were moved from the communities that were displaced, and so on and so forth. During the pandemic, I created an audio version, a podcast tour, so that you could drive in your car safely without seeing other tourists, being stuck in a bus. And you can also be an armchair tourist. And so this is the last project. So one of the other things that I'm doing is working on ways to expand the representations of the watershed. It's a very large and complex system. It's very hard to represent. This is basically the visualization. This is what exists. It's the city's official map of the water supply, and it shows you the scale and the geography of the infrastructure, but doesn't tell us much about how this infrastructure is also a social connector. So I want to make, representations that make these more visible. So this is performing infrastructure. It's a workshop/performance in which people make a human diagram of New York City's drinking water system based on the city's map. And so it visualizes the physical connections between the parts of the water system. And so each participant wears a costume or holds a prop. There's a little watershed cosplay so that they can be an element in the system. And they form the connections between the parts of the system with their arms and their hands. And after the diagram is in place, they create this kind of infrastructure orchestra in which they vocalize the water flowing through the system. So just to wrap up, this project is silly. People are wearing paper hats and weird neckwear. They're giggling, they're holding hands. It's very feel good. But what it gets at for me is very serious. It's that water and water infrastructure is a social connector, and that there are really important human relationships embodied in this infrastructural landscape. And by embodying the map of those relationships in different ways, New York City residents can better understand the underlying policy-driven relationships to this infrastructure, but in a way that's more connected and more rooted in place. So thank you very much.